Good evening. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. If you're settling in for the night, we invite you to make yourself comfortable, adjust your pillows, dim your lights, and allow yourself to sink into the rhythm of our narrative. Tonight we journey backward through time to an era that, on the surface, appears distant and quaint, a time of corsets, grand estates, and elaborate social ceremonies. Yet beneath the lace and velvet of the Victorian period lies a profoundly complex reality, one that shaped the lives of millions of women in ways both subtle and profound. The Victorian era, roughly spanning from 1837 to 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria herself, is often romanticized in popular imagination. We envision ball gowns and devoted husbands, romance and refined sensibilities. But for the women living through this period, marriage was far more complicated than the romantic stories would suggest. It was a legal arrangement with genuine consequences, a social obligation with deeply personal costs, and a transition that fundamentally altered every aspect of a woman's existence. This evening, we will explore the lived reality of marriage for women during this transformative period in history. We will walk through their homes, witness their daily struggles, examine the laws that bound them, and understand the quiet resilience with which they navigated their circumstances. We will move slowly through time, allowing the details to accumulate, building a picture of a world that is, in many ways, entirely foreign to our own. So, settle in, breathe deeply, and prepare yourself for a gentle descent into the drawing rooms and bedrooms, the hopes and heartbreaks of Victorian womanhood. Imagine yourself waking in the pre-dawn darkness of a Victorian household. The room is cold, the fire has burned low during the night, and the servants have not yet come to revive it. You lie beneath heavy layers of blankets and quilts, your body still adorned in a nightgown of cotton or linen, long-sleeved and high-necked, as propriety demands even in sleep. The house around you are quiet. Somewhere below stairs, the servants are already stirring, the kitchen maids lighting fires, the scullery maid beginning the endless cycle of drawing water and heating it. The rhythm of their lives, though invisible to you in this moment, is already well underway, but you, as the mistress of the house, have different rhythms to follow. By 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, a servant arrives with hot water. The pitcher is heavy, filled with water heated in the kitchen below. You wash your face and hands with care, using soap that may be perfumed with lavender or rose. The cold water shocks your skin slightly, but you are accustomed to this. This is the reality of Victorian bathing. Full immersion in a tub is a rare luxury, reserved perhaps for once a week, if that. Daily hygiene means washing in portions, in carefully heated water, in the privacy of your bedroom. Now begins the lengthy process of dressing. What we might accomplish in minutes takes you the better part of an hour. You begin with layers. First the chemise, a simple shift of cotton or linen that serves as the foundation for everything else. Then come the stockings, pulled up and secured with garters just below the knee. The corset is waiting, whether you are a young woman still residing with your parents, or an established married woman. The corset is non-negotiable. It is, to your society, as essential as shoes. The corset is a marvel of engineering and a constraint in equal measure, made of cotton, linen, or silk, reinforced with whalebone or steel. It shapes your body into the silhouette that is considered beautiful and proper. A tiny waist, an elevated bosom, a straight back. A lady's maid, if you have one, helps you into it, pulling the laces tight. If you are less fortunate in your circumstances, you manage as best you can alone. The sensation is familiar. You have worn a corset since you were perhaps 12 years old. Your ribs adjust to the pressure. Your breathing becomes shallower. Your posture automatically straightens. This is simply what it means to be a respectable woman. Over the corset comes a chemisette or corset cover, a thin layer of fabric that prevents the boning from showing through your dress. Then the petticoat or petticoats, often multiple layers of cotton or wool, stiffened with starch, creating the full skirt that is the hallmark of Victorian fashion. The weight accumulates around your hips and legs. Then, finally, the dress itself. If this is a morning dress, it is perhaps made of cotton, wool, or a wool blend, modest in cut, with long sleeves and a neckline that rises to the collarbone or higher. The skirt extends to your ankles. If you move quickly, the hem brushes the floor. As you catch your reflection in the mirror, assuming you have access to one, You see a figure that is almost unrecognizable as a body. The corset has created an hourglass shape that is exaggerated, almost artificial. Your waist appears impossibly small. Your breasts are pushed upward and together. This is beauty. This is propriety. And this is what you will wear, in some form, every single day for the rest of your life. By 9 or 9:30 in the morning, you are ready to leave your bedroom. Your hair has been arranged, either by yourself or with the aid of a servant, into whatever style is currently fashionable. If you are young and unmarried, your hair may be down, arranged in ringlets or waves. If you are married or older, it is likely pinned up, gathered at the crown or the back of the head, perhaps with a decorative comb or net. The arrangement took time, perhaps 20 minutes of careful work with curling irons heated on the fire, or with pins and papers if your hair was dressed the night before and left in place overnight. You descend the stairs to the morning room or parlor. This is often the first moment of the day when you encounter other members of your household. If you are married and have children, they may be with their governess or nanny, being educated or occupied in the nursery. If you are unmarried, your mother or a chaperone may be present. A husband, if you have one, may take breakfast elsewhere or have already departed for his business or social engagements. The rhythm of the household does not revolve around keeping everyone together. Rather, it is organized around gender and propriety. Breakfast is a substantial meal. There is tea, hot, strong, and milky as you prefer it, along with bread, butter, jam, perhaps eggs, bacon, kippers, or cold meats left over from the previous evening. You eat slowly, perhaps reading the morning paper or a letter that has arrived in the post. The pace is leisurely, at least for you. Elsewhere in the house, servants are eating a simpler meal, standing in the kitchen consuming their food quickly before returning to their work. By 11 o'clock, your real day's work begins. If you are the mistress of a household of any significance, this is when you conduct your business. You meet with the housekeeper to discuss menus for the coming days, to allocate supplies, to address any problems with servants or household management. The housekeeper presents her accounts, the cost of food, coal, repairs, supplies. You review these with care. A respectable wife is expected to be a competent household manager to ensure that the domestic realm runs smoothly and efficiently. This is not leisure, this is responsibility. You may write letters. Correspondence is a significant part of a lady's day. You write to friends, to family members living in other parts of the country or the world, to tradespeople with whom you conduct business. Your handwriting is perhaps your most refined accomplishment, and you take care with every letter, using good paper and good ink. These letters may take an hour or more to complete. If you have daughters, particularly if they are of marriageable age, the mid-morning. Hours may be devoted to their instruction or supervision. A governess may handle their formal education, languages, drawing, music, needlework, but you oversee their social training. You instruct them in how to conduct themselves properly, in the subtle arts of flirtation and conversation that are considered appropriate for young ladies. If your family has the means, you may be preparing them for the social season, that whirlwind of balls and dinner parties where daughters are introduced to eligible gentlemen. By midday or just past it, lunch, or luncheon, as it is increasingly called, is served. This is a lighter meal than breakfast, perhaps consisting of cold meats, bread, cheese, fruit, and tea. It is often eaten quickly, without ceremony. Then, if the weather permits, you may take an airing, a walk or a drive in a carriage, for the sake of your health and constitution. A lady's health is considered delicate, and fresh air and gentle exercise are believed to be beneficial. You dress in an outdoor coat, a hat, and gloves. Your maid accompanies you if you walk, or you take the carriage if your family can afford it. You move slowly through the streets or the park, seeing and being seen, maintaining your place in the social fabric of your community. The afternoon is devoted to visitors and social calls. If you are established in society, visitors may call upon you between 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You receive them in your drawing room, served by servants who bring tea and perhaps cakes or biscuits. The conversation is carefully modulated. News, gossip about other families, perhaps discussion of upcoming events or social engagements. You must be attentive but not overly eager, gracious but not effusive. There is an entire language of social interaction that you have been taught since childhood, and you navigate it with practiced ease. Alternatively, you may make calls yourself, leaving your visiting card at the homes of acquaintances and friends. If they are at home and receiving visitors, you may be invited in for a brief conversation. If they are not at home, you simply leave your card, a small printed rectangle with your name, as a gesture of social connection. These calls are not informal, they are part of the machinery of Victorian society, the means by which social hierarchies are maintained and relationships are established and preserved. As afternoon drifts toward evening, you return home. Now comes another change of dress. The morning dress must be removed, and an afternoon dress, slightly more formal, perhaps in a richer fabric or with more elaborate trimming, is donned. If you are to dine at home with family only, the change may be minimal. If you are expecting dinner guests or planning to attend an evening event, the preparation becomes more elaborate. Dinner, the main meal of the day, typically occurs at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, though the hour has been gradually shifting later throughout the Victorian period. The dining room is warm, well lit by candles or gas lamps. The table is set with an array of dishes, silver and glassware, that can seem bewildering in its complexity. You sit at one end of the table, opposite your husband, or at a position designated by family hierarchy. Servants stand behind chairs, serving dishes, pouring wine, clearing plates between courses. Dinner is a performance of sorts. There is an expected order of courses, an expected way of holding cutlery and glasses, an expected manner of eating, small bites, minimal noise, no reaching across others for items. If there are guests present, the conversation is expected to flow smoothly, touching on acceptable topics while carefully avoiding anything controversial or unpleasant. The meal may last 2 hours or more. After dinner, if there are no guests and no evening engagements planned, you retire to the drawing room. This is traditionally a female space. Your husband may join you here, or he may remain in the dining room or withdraw to his study with other gentlemen if guests are present. In the drawing room, you may embroider, read, play the pianoforte, or simply sit in conversation. The evening is the one time of day when life slows, when the demands of social performance ease slightly. But even here, you are expected to be occupied. A woman of leisure who is visibly idle is considered idle in character as well. By 10 or 11 o'clock, the household begins to retire. You return to your bedroom, where a servant has prepared your nightgown and your bed. You undress, shedding the layers of the day. The corset that has constrained you for 16 hours or more is finally removed, and your body can breathe again. You don the nightgown, and your hair is unpinned, combed out, and perhaps braided for the night. As you lie in bed waiting for sleep, you might reflect on the day just past. It has been, in many ways, a repetition of the day before, and it will be repeated again tomorrow, and the day after that, and countless days into the future. This is the rhythm of a Victorian lady's life, a rhythm of dressing and undressing, of carefully modulated social interaction, of household management and the performance of propriety. It is a life defined by constraint, both physical and social, yet within these constraints, women have learned to navigate, to find meaning, and to exercise what agency they can. This, then, is the daily reality. Now we turn our attention to how a woman arrives at this life, through that pivotal and transformative event that society considers the pinnacle of female existence, marriage itself. To understand what marriage meant for a Victorian woman, we must first understand what came before it, the years of preparation, the hopes and anxieties, the precise social machinery designed to deliver young women into matrimony. Let us trace a path through these years, moving slowly through the formative experiences that shaped a woman's understanding of her own future. Our subject is a woman of the middle class, not wealthy enough to be entirely exempt from economic concerns, but prosperous enough to participate fully in society. She is born in approximately 1860, which means her coming of age occurs in the 1870s and 1880s, the heart of the mature Victorian period. Her father is a man of business, perhaps a banker, a merchant, or a professional of some standing. Her mother is, of course, a lady of leisure, her primary occupation being the management of the household and the social advancement of her children. From her earliest childhood, our subject understands, in ways both explicit and implicit, that her future is marriage. This is not presented as one option among many. It is presented as the inevitable, natural, and only respectable path for a woman of her station. Her brothers may become lawyers, doctors, military officers, or men of business. They have choices, or at least the illusion of choices. She has one acceptable destination, though the route to it is obscured and uncertain. Her education reflects this understanding. She is taught to read and write, to be sure, and her parents ensure she has access to literature, history, and perhaps some instruction in French or Italian. But her education is fundamentally different from her brothers. Where they are prepared for intellectual achievement and professional competition, she is prepared to be an ornament to a man of standing. Her schooling emphasizes accomplishments, the things that will make her attractive to a suitable husband. She learns to play the pianoforte. Hours are spent at the keyboard, fingers moving through scales and simple pieces, until she can play with sufficient competence to entertain guests after dinner. She learns to draw and paint, typically landscapes or still life compositions, skills that demonstrate refined sensibility without intellectual pretension. She learns needlework, embroidery, netting, beadwork, the endless productive leisure that is expected of ladies. She learns to dance, moving through the prescribed steps of country dances and waltzes with a grace that is meant to be admired, but never too vivacious. Most importantly, she learns deportment. She learns how to sit, how to walk, how to hold her body at all times with an awareness that she is being observed. She learns to modulate her voice, to speak in measured tones that suggest education without appearing pedantic. She learns to laugh without being loud, to smile without being forward, to engage in conversation without dominating it. She learns, in essence, to perform femininity, to embody an ideal of womanhood that is passive, graceful, and fundamentally subordinate. Through her teenage years, a subtle shift occurs. As she approaches what is considered marriageable age, anywhere from 18 to 22 years old, the focus of her world narrows toward a specific goal. Her mother begins to speak more frequently about her future. Suitable young men are pointed out at social gatherings. Her appearance becomes a matter of increasing attention. Her dresses are chosen with more care, their fabrics finer, their colors more becoming. She is being prepared, though the process is rarely discussed directly, for market. By 18 or 19, if her family has sufficient means, she is presented to society. The presentation itself is an elaborate ritual. She is taken to London or to the nearest major city, dressed in white or very pale colors. White is essential, as it symbolizes virginity, purity, and eligibility. The dress is formal, often with a train, adorned with flowers in her hair. She is presented at court or at the homes of prominent families, in a ceremony that is meant to announce her availability for marriage to the eligible men of her social class. This presentation is not casual. A young woman's family has invested considerable time and money in preparing her, and the presentation itself is expensive. New wardrobes must be purchased, if she is taken to London for the season. Accommodations must be secured, and her mother or a chaperone must accompany her. The investment reflects the significance of the endeavor. A woman's family is, in essence, placing their hopes for her future on display. The season, the social season that runs through spring and early summer, is a whirlwind of activity designed entirely around facilitating introductions between young women and suitable young men. There are balls, evening events held in grand homes or hotels, where young women dance with eligible gentlemen, always under the watchful eyes of chaperones. There are garden parties, picnics, theater outings, all occasions designed to create opportunities for young people to interact in controlled settings. For our subject, the season is simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. She dances with men she has never met, men whose names she might not even remember the next day. She smiles and converses and performs the role she has been taught to play. But beneath the performance, there is anxiety. She is keenly aware that this season, This one season, or perhaps two, is when her matrimonial fate will be decided. If she does not attract an offer during these carefully orchestrated weeks, her prospects diminish. If she remains unmarried past 25, she begins to be considered a spinster, a failure, a woman who has missed her opportunity. The pressure is immense, though it is rarely spoken about aloud. It is embedded in the glances her mother gives her, in the emphasis placed on her appearance, in the frequency with which eligible gentlemen are pointed out and encouraged to approach her. She must be attractive without being presumptuous, accomplished without being threatening, pleasant without being memorable. She must strike a balance that is, in truth, nearly impossible to achieve. Then, one evening at a ball, a man approaches her. Perhaps he is a gentleman of good family and adequate income. Perhaps he is somewhat older already, established in his career or his estate. Perhaps he is not handsome or interesting or exciting, but he is respectable, and his attention is flattering. They dance together. They exchange a few words. He calls upon her family in the following days. The conversations between this gentleman and her father begin. The discussions are, of course, entirely between the men. The young woman is excluded from the most important negotiations regarding her own future. Her father and the gentleman discuss finances, the gentleman's income, his prospects, his family's standing. If the terms are agreeable, if the gentleman's position is sufficiently secure, the conversations progress. If not, they cease, and life continues its search. But if the conditions are favorable, at some point, usually after only a few weeks of acquaintance, the gentleman asks her father for permission to propose. He does not ask her first. He asks her father. Her father, having already agreed in principle, grants this permission. Only then does the gentleman approach the young woman herself, usually in some semi-private setting arranged for the purpose, and asks her to marry him. In this moment, our subject faces what is nominally a choice, but a choice constrained by enormous pressure. She may, technically, refuse, but refusal carries significant social consequences. To refuse an offer from a respectable gentleman without compelling reason marks a woman as foolish, ungrateful, or difficult. Her family may pressure her to accept. Her mother may weep at the thought of her daughter's waywardness. Her father may become angry at the waste of an opportunity. Her sister's prospects may be affected if she is seen as bringing shame upon the family. Moreover, she has been taught from her earliest childhood that marriage is her purpose, her security, her salvation. An unmarried woman, in her world, is fundamentally incomplete. She has no legal status separate from her father or another male guardian. She has no financial independence. She cannot even travel without a chaperone. Marriage is presented as the solution to all these limitations, the pathway to becoming a full participant in adult society. So, in most cases, she says yes. The engagement that follows is typically brief, a few weeks to a few months. During this time, preparations begin. Her trousseau is assembled, the clothes and household items she will bring to her marriage. These purchases are considerable and expensive. New dresses are made, underthings are sewn, linens are embroidered with her initials or her new married monogram. These items are displayed to friends and family in a ritual called viewing the trousseau, where guests admire the young woman's preparations and, implicitly, comment on her suitability as a wife. Her wedding is planned. If her family has means, it will be a substantial affair, held in a church, attended by numerous guests with a reception afterward. She will wear white, a long dress carefully designed to display her youth and purity while maintaining absolute propriety. Her mother will weep, her friends will embrace her, toasts will be made to her future happiness. But beneath the ritual and the celebration, there is something else occurring, something that is rarely discussed but deeply felt. Our subject is preparing to leave her home, her family, and her known world. She is preparing to place herself entirely under the authority of a man whom she has known, in total, perhaps for a few months. She is preparing to enter into a contract, for marriage is a legal contract, though the terms are written entirely by the law, not by her, that will define her existence for the rest of her life. The legal reality of what she is about to do, though it may not be explained to her in these terms, is profound. Upon marriage, she will cease to exist as a legal person. Her property becomes her husband's. Her earnings, if she has any, become his. Her body becomes, legally, his property as well. She loses the right to enter into contracts, to own property, to control her own money. She becomes what is known in law as a femme covert, a covered woman, hidden beneath her husband's legal identity. Where once she was Miss, daughter of her father, she will become Mrs., identified entirely through her husband. She may not know these details explicitly. Victorian society does not encourage young women to contemplate the legal realities of marriage. They are taught to think of marriage in terms of romance, duty, and domestic fulfillment. But some understanding permeates the culture. She has heard her mother's complaints about money matters. She has heard whispered conversations about a woman friend whose husband drank or gambled. She knows, on some level, that her future is no longer entirely her own. On her wedding day, dressed in white, her hand given to her husband by her father, she speaks vows that bind her to obedience and duty. The vow she makes is to love, honor, and obey. The vow her husband makes is to love and cherish. Notice the absence of obey. Even in the most sacred moment of her life, the asymmetry is encoded into the very language of the ceremony. As she leaves the church on her husband's arm, as she waves goodbye to her family, as she prepares to depart for her honeymoon and her new home, she is crossing a threshold from which there is no return. She is entering into the state that society has told her is her purpose, her security, her happiness. She is becoming a wife. What this means, what it truly means, in the privacy of the home, in the silent hours of the night, in the long years that stretch ahead, is what we must now explore. There exists, in the historical record, a profound silence. It is a silence about one of the most fundamental aspects of marriage, a silence so complete and so deliberate that it has left scholars, historians, and readers struggling to piece together what actually occurred in the bedrooms of Victorian homes. This silence itself is revealing, and in exploring it, we encounter a mystery that speaks volumes about the culture that created it. The mystery concerns sex, or rather the Victorian relationship to sex, and most particularly, the place of sexuality within marriage for women. Let us begin with what the culture officially taught young women about this aspect of marriage. The answer, in most cases, is almost nothing. A young woman of respectable family would likely reach her wedding night with minimal, if any, specific knowledge about what would occur between her and her husband. She might have received vague warnings from her mother or an older female relative, oblique comments about her duties, exhortations to be obedient and patient with her husband's passions. A particularly forward-thinking or compassionate mother might have provided somewhat more detail, might have explained, in euphemistic terms, that there would be discomfort, or that her husband had certain needs that it was her obligation to fulfill. But beyond these cryptic instructions, silence. Complete, absolute silence. What did a young woman actually know? She may have observed animals. A farm girl might have witnessed the mating of livestock and drawn certain conclusions. She might have read literature, and in the novels considered appropriate for young ladies there were occasional hints, though nothing explicit. She might have overheard conversations between older women, whispered discussions that stopped abruptly when a younger person entered the room. She might have heard crude jokes or boasts from male relatives or family friends, though such talk was considered entirely inappropriate in her presence, and she was expected to pretend not to understand. But for the most part, a respectable young woman entered her marriage bed in a state of profound ignorance about what her husband would expect of her, and what would be expected of her body. The wedding night itself was often traumatic, a sudden, bewildering, and frequently painful introduction to her marital obligations. Victorian medical literature and the few candid accounts that have survived suggest that the wedding night was, for many women, a shock and a source of considerable distress. The combination of fear, pain, blood, and the physical dominance of a stranger, for despite the social rituals of courtship, her husband was still largely a stranger, created a traumatic experience that would color a woman's entire approach to marital relations. But here we encounter the mystery. What, exactly, happened in those private moments? What did Victorians think about sexuality, And how did this thinking affect women's lived experiences? The Victorian era is often characterized, both by people living at the time and by later historians, as sexually repressive. The image persists of a culture that was prudish, that viewed sexuality with shame and disgust, that confined all discussion of the body and its functions to the medical sphere. And there is truth to this characterization. The culture did enforce strict codes of sexual propriety, particularly for women. The very mention of certain body parts or functions was considered obscene, but the reality is more complex, more contradictory, and in many ways darker than this simple narrative of repression. Victorian men, including married men, were not necessarily expected to be sexually restrained. The culture of gentlemen included, for many men, the use of prostitutes, the maintenance of mistresses, and the general assumption that male sexuality was a natural force that required outlet. The double standard was not hidden, it was explicitly acknowledged and defended. A man might be excused for sexual indiscretion, a woman could not. Moreover, within marriage itself, there was an expectation of sexual relations. A wife was understood to have a marital duty, an obligation to submit to her husband's sexual demands. This obligation was not incidental to marriage, it was central to its definition. The refusal of sexual relations was considered grounds for marital discord, and could be cited, in some contexts, as justification for a husband's infidelity. Yet simultaneously, the culture maintained an official position that respectable women did not experience sexual desire. This was a fundamental tenet of Victorian ideology about women. A respectable woman was passionless, sexless, pure. Sexual desire was considered either a pathological condition or an indicator of a woman's lack of respectability. The respectable woman endured her husband's sexual attentions as a duty, but did not enjoy them or seek them out. The contradiction is staggering. Women were supposed to have a duty to provide sex to their husbands, yet were not supposed to have any sexual feeling about it. They were supposed to be willing partners in a transaction to which they could not consent in any meaningful legal sense, and in which they were expected to take no pleasure. How did women navigate this impossible contradiction? The historical record, being largely silent, leaves us to piece together fragments. Some women appear to have internalized the ideology completely. Their diaries and letters suggest that they accepted the doctrine of female passionlessness as truth, and that they experienced their marital relations as dutiful but joyless obligations. They submitted to their husbands' demands, and considered this submission a mark of respectability and virtue. They may have experienced pain, discomfort, or simple disinterest, and they accepted these sensations as natural and unavoidable. Other women, however, appear to have experienced sexuality differently. Some letters and diaries that have survived suggest that some Victorian women did experience sexual desire, did enjoy sexual relations with their husbands, and did find meaning and pleasure in physical intimacy. These women were not necessarily rebellious or disreputable, they simply did not conform to the official ideology of passionlessness. There are hints, too, of women who experience sexual coercion or violence within marriage. A husband's right to sexual access to his wife was nearly absolute. The concept of marital rape did not exist in Victorian law. A wife had no legal recourse if her husband forced himself upon her. She had no claim on her own body, it was legally his property, and he had the right to use it as he saw fit. The medical literature of the period reflects the anxieties about female sexuality, the cultural obsession with controlling and containing it. Doctors worried about female masturbation and prescribed restraints and treatments to prevent it. They discussed hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for women's emotional and physical ailments that was believed to be caused, at least in part, by sexual frustration or excess. They prescribed remedies ranging from cold water baths to various mechanical devices designed to prevent women from touching themselves. There were also medical discussions about the proper frequency of sexual relations within marriage. Doctors debated whether weekly relations, monthly relations, or some other frequency was appropriate. These discussions treated women's sexuality as something to be regulated and controlled, not as something to be understood or respected. The mystery deepens when we consider the question of reproduction. Victorian marriage for women was inextricably linked to motherhood. Yet Victorian women also developed and used methods of birth control, despite the official condemnation of such practices. How did they obtain contraceptive information? How did they negotiate its use with husbands who might have disapproved? These are questions that historical records rarely answer, but the existence of contraceptive use suggests that some women did manage, despite the cultural and legal prohibitions against it, to exercise some measure of control over their own bodies and reproduction. Consider the simple arithmetic of Victorian fertility. In the mid-Victorian period, the average woman bore between 5 and 7 children. By the end of the Victorian era, this number had declined to approximately 3 or 4. This decline occurred before the modern contraceptive methods that we associate with the 20th century sexual revolution. It occurred largely through abstinence, withdrawal, and the use of barriers like condoms or cervical caps or douching, methods that required cooperation or at least acquiescence between partners. How was this accomplished in a culture that did not openly discuss sex, that maintained that respectable women had no sexual desire, that gave husbands absolute rights over their wives' bodies? The answer lies partly in the fact that the official ideology and actual practice were not the same. Behind closed doors, in the privacy of bedrooms, negotiations occurred that are largely invisible to the historical record. Women found ways to communicate their wishes to their husbands. Some women refused sexual relations, or limited their frequency. Some husbands, despite the ideology, cared enough about their wives' well-being to limit frequency, or to practice some form of birth control. But we must be careful not to romanticize this. For many women, the reality was quite different. They bore children in rapid succession, sometimes nearly every year, until their bodies were worn out, until their health was permanently damaged, until they died in childbirth, or from complications of repeated pregnancy and delivery. The question of how many women died in childbirth during the Victorian era is itself somewhat obscured by the historical record, but the numbers are significant. Death in childbirth was the leading cause of death for women of childbearing age. A woman who married had a substantial likelihood of dying as a result of her reproductive role. This risk was not incidental to marriage, it was central to it. And yet, the culture maintained a romanticized, even sentimental, view of motherhood. Mothers were supposed to be self-sacrificing, devoted entirely to their children's welfare. The pain and danger of childbirth were presented as a noble sacrifice, a mark of a woman's virtue and maternal love. The danger itself was not hidden. Everyone knew that childbirth could be fatal, but it was reframed as a noble risk, something a respectable woman should accept without complaint. Here, then, is the core of the mystery. Victorian culture created a system in which women's sexuality was simultaneously demanded and denied, in which women were expected to reproduce without controlling their own reproduction, in which women were supposed to find fulfillment in motherhood while being denied the information or autonomy to manage their own fertility and health. The silence that surrounds this aspect of Victorian life, the silence in the diaries and letters that were carefully edited and censored by later generations, the silence in the official ideology that denied female sexuality while demanding female compliance, speaks to a profound discomfort with the contradictions that the system created. In the archaeological record of letters and diaries, in medical texts and advice books, we can piece together fragments of the truth. We find women complaining of exhaustion after repeated pregnancies. We find hints of women consulting with other women about methods to limit conception. We find the occasional candid statement about the difficulty or unpleasantness of marital relations. We find references to miscarriage and infant mortality that seem almost nonchalant in their frequency. And in all of this, we find the shape of a system designed to control women's bodies, to harness women's sexuality for the purpose of reproduction, while simultaneously denying that women had any legitimate interest in sex for its own sake. It was a system that treated women as vessels for reproduction, as vehicles for the continuation of society and property, while denying their humanity and their agency. This is the mystery we have been exploring. Not the mystery of what exactly happened in the bedrooms of Victorian homes, though that remains partly unknowable, But the mystery of how a culture could maintain such profound contradictions, and how women endured, and in many cases found ways to navigate, resist, and survive within this impossible system. Thus far, our journey has taken us primarily through the world of the middle class, a world of respectable propriety, of drawing rooms and calling cards, of carefully managed social appearance. But Victorian England was not a monolithic society. The experience of marriage varied significantly depending on one's position within the rigid hierarchy of class that structured all of Victorian life. To understand the full reality of marriage for Victorian women, we must venture beyond the middle-class parlor and explore how marriage was experienced and how it functioned differently across the social landscape. Let us begin with those at the apex of society, the aristocracy and the gentry, the women who occupied grand estates and moved in circles where titles and ancient family names mattered enormously. For a woman of the aristocracy, marriage was, in many respects, even more thoroughly a matter of property and dynastic consideration than it was for the middle class. A noble family's marriage negotiations were explicit, unapologetic, and conducted with the same attention to detail that might be applied to negotiating the sale of land or the management of investments. A young woman of good family might have her marriage arranged with very little regard for her own preferences or feelings. Her value lay not in her individual qualities, but in her family connections, her dowry, and her reproductive capacity. A marriage between two aristocratic families was a business arrangement designed to consolidate property, to unite families, to strengthen political alliances. The bride herself was, in many ways, incidental to these larger purposes. She might be married to a man decades her senior, to a distant cousin, to someone chosen primarily for the benefits his family's connections would bring. Yet there were, paradoxically, certain freedoms available to aristocratic women that were denied to their middle-class sisters. Once an aristocratic woman had produced heirs, sons to inherit the title and property. Her duties, in some sense, were fulfilled. If her marriage was unhappy, if she found her husband's company unbearable, she might, if she was discreet, establish a separate life within society. She might maintain a country house while her husband maintained another. She might cultivate a circle of close female friends and companions. She might, if she was sufficiently clever and careful, take a lover. The aristocracy's attitude towards sexuality, while still bound by the official codes of respectability, was somewhat more pragmatic than that of the middle class. An aristocratic husband might maintain a mistress openly, with the understanding of his wife. An aristocratic wife, if she was discreet enough, might do the same, though the consequences, if discovered, were far more severe for her than for her husband. The difference was one of degree rather than kind, but it was a significant degree. Moreover, aristocratic women had access to education, to networks of influence, to property and money that gave them a degree of agency unavailable to women of other classes. They could commission art, establish charitable foundations, participate in cultural and intellectual life. They were constrained by gender, certainly, but their constraint was mitigated by wealth and social position. The lives of aristocratic women, while not free in any absolute sense, were lives of considerable privilege compared to those below them on the social scale. Now let us descend the social ladder and consider the women of the professional and merchant classes, the solicitors' wives, the doctors' wives, the wives of successful businessmen. These were the women who populated the world we explored in our opening segments. Their marriages were in many ways the model marriages of Victorian ideology. They were expected to be the paragons of respectability, the embodiment of proper womanhood. For these women, marriage was simultaneously a more precarious affair than for aristocratic women, and yet in some ways more secure. Their husband's income and professional standing were crucial to family survival. A woman's success in attracting a husband of good prospects was genuinely important. Her comfort, her security, and her social position depended upon it. Yet, once married, a woman of the middle class had fewer means of escape if her marriage proved unhappy. She had less money, less power, fewer connections. She was more thoroughly dependent on her husband's goodwill. For these women, the ideology of marriage as a romantic institution had particular force. Because their marriages were not explicitly arranged by family negotiation in the way aristocratic marriages might be, there was a greater emphasis on love, on personal compatibility, on the notion that a woman had chosen her partner. This ideology, while potentially more psychologically fulfilling for some women, also served to place blame on women for unhappy marriages. If a marriage failed or proved miserable, it was not seen as an unfortunate circumstance or a matter of bad luck, but rather as a failure on the woman's part, failure to choose wisely, to adapt properly, to make the best of her situation. The middle-class wife was expected to find fulfillment in domesticity, in the management of her household, in motherhood, and the education of her children. This ideology was particularly strong for this class because it served an important function. It justified the exclusion of middle-class women from the world of work and public life, even as middle-class women increasingly gained access to education and demonstrated intellectual capacity equal to men. Now, let us look downward again, to the working class, to the wives of laborers, factory workers, shop assistants, and servants. For these women, marriage presented a very different set of challenges and possibilities. A working-class woman typically had no dowry, no family property to bring to her marriage. Her value lay almost entirely in her capacity to work and to bear children who could contribute to the family's income. While a middle-class woman might be urged to learn accomplishments that would make her attractive as a wife, a working-class girl was more likely to be trained for work, in domestic service, in factories, in shops, or in her future role as a wife and mother who would manage a working-class household. For a working-class woman, marriage did not represent an escape from labor. If anything, marriage intensified her labor. As a wife, she was responsible for keeping house on a very limited income, for stretching every penny to feed and clothe her family. She bore children often in rapid succession, without the medical care available to wealthier women. She took in laundry, did needlework, or engaged in other forms of piecework to supplement the family income. She nursed sick family members. She prepared meals over a small fire or stove. She scrubbed floors and washed clothes and tended gardens. The physical toll on working-class women was severe. Repeated pregnancies, poor nutrition, exhaustion from overwork, exposure to disease, and limited access to medical care meant that working-class women aged rapidly and were subject to a range of chronic illnesses. Women who survived childbirth were often left with damaged bodies, prolapsed uteruses, chronic pain, infections, and other complications that went untreated because there was no money for medical care and no time to recover. Yet, paradoxically, working-class women may have had somewhat more autonomy within their marriages than middle-class women. Because they were expected to work, to contribute to the family income, they could not be entirely economically dependent on their husbands in the way middle-class women were. They had skills, they had knowledge of trades or crafts, they had the ability to earn money. This did not translate into equality. Their husbands still controlled family finances and made major decisions, but it meant that their economic dependence was not total. Moreover, the ideology of female passionlessness and female domesticity was weaker among the working class. Working-class women could not afford to be ornaments, they were workers. Their sexuality was not idealized in the same way. They were subject to different kinds of sexual predation and exploitation. They were vulnerable to unwanted advances from employers, from men of higher social class, but they were not supposed to be passionless in the way middle-class women were. Some working-class women appear to have exercised a degree of agency in choosing their partners that was less available to middle-class women. Working-class courtship was less formally controlled, less mediated by family negotiations. Young people might know each other through work, through church, through neighborhood. Marriages could be based on genuine affection or attraction, or at least on more direct personal knowledge. But this relative autonomy came at a cost. Working-class women who became pregnant before marriage faced severe social consequences. An illegitimate child was a profound disgrace, and such a woman might find herself cast out by her family, unable to find respectable employment, vulnerable to destitution. The freedom to interact more openly with young men came with a severe punishment for transgression. We must also consider, though it is often overlooked in discussions of Victorian marriage, the women who did not marry at all. These were the women, spinsters as they were called, with all the connotations of failure and incompleteness that the term carried, who, for various reasons, never entered into marriage. Some never married by choice, though this choice was heavily constrained by social pressure and economic necessity. Some were the daughters of clergymen, or other men of modest means who could not afford dowries to secure good marriages for all their daughters. Some were women who had been engaged and then disappointed when their fiancés died or proved unsuitable. Some were women who were considered unmarriageable for reasons of appearance, temperament, or family circumstances. For these women, marriage had been presented as the ultimate goal, the pinnacle of female achievement, and its non-occurrence was often experienced as a profound failure. They were dependent on the charity of relatives, or they found ways to earn their own living through work as governesses, teachers, companions, or in other positions available to single women. Yet paradoxically, being single, though economically precarious and socially stigmatized, granted certain freedoms. An unmarried woman, particularly if she had some financial independence, could move about more freely than a married woman. She could travel, live alone or with other women, pursue education or work. She was not subject to a husband's authority or a husband's sexual demands. She maintained, in legal terms, some of the property rights and autonomy that marriage stripped away. Some unmarried women found companionship and fulfillment in relationships with other women, long-term living arrangements, deep emotional bonds, intensive correspondence. These relationships occupied an ambiguous space in Victorian society. They were not understood as sexual, or if they were, this understanding was carefully suppressed. They existed in a kind of blind spot in the culture's moral vigilance. For some women, remaining unmarried may have been a deliberate choice, though a choice never openly acknowledged. As one unmarried woman wrote in her diary, "I have chosen my fate, and though I may sometimes regret the choice, I find more happiness in my independence than I could ever have found in marriage." We must consider, too, the women whose marriages ended through death. Widows occupied a particular place in Victorian society. A widow was no longer under a husband's authority, yet she was also marked by her previous marriage, no longer eligible for marriage herself, or at least remarriage carried significant social complications. A widow with children and property might exercise a degree of control over her own affairs, particularly as she aged. She might travel, make her own decisions, and participate in society in ways that married women could not. Some widows actively avoided remarriage, preferring the independence they had gained through their husband's death. Others remarried quickly, driven by economic necessity or by the stigma attached to remaining single. But those who remained widows might find, paradoxically, a degree of freedom in their married state. They had been through marriage, fulfilled their duty, and now could live on their own terms, or at least with somewhat more autonomy than they had possessed before. Across all these varieties of experience, aristocratic and middle class, working class and unmarried, widow and spinster, certain constants emerge. Marriage was the expected and enforced path for women. It represented both the apex of female achievement and a fundamental loss of autonomy and rights. It was presented as women's salvation and their purpose, yet it could also be a source of profound unhappiness, danger, and suffering. The ideology of marriage was powerful and pervasive, shaped differently by class but present everywhere. Yet actual marriages varied enormously. Some women found genuine contentment, even happiness in their marriages. Others endured quietly. Some resisted in small, quiet ways. Through the refusal of sex, through the limitation of childbearing, through the cultivation of relationships outside marriage, through the maintenance of property or earnings, or intellectual engagement. The system was rigid, but within it, women found ways to negotiate, to resist, and to survive. These ways were often invisible, often left no trace in the historical record, but they mattered profoundly for the women living through them. To fully understand the dark reality of marriage for Victorian women, we must pause in our narrative and turn our attention to something that may seem dry and abstract, the legal framework that structured marriage and defined women's place within it. Yet this legal framework is anything but abstract. It is the skeleton upon which all the daily realities, the anxieties, the constraints, and the suffering we have described are built. The law did not merely reflect Victorian attitudes toward women. It actively created and enforced them, turning philosophical beliefs about female subordination into concrete restrictions on women's lives. When a woman married in Victorian England, she underwent a legal transformation that had few parallels in the modern world. The transformation was so complete that it had a name: coverture. The term itself comes from medieval law, from the notion that a woman who married became covered by her husband's legal identity. She ceased in many significant respects to be a legal person at all. The doctrine of coverture was based on a principle articulated centuries earlier. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. This was not merely metaphorical language. It was law, and it had concrete consequences. Under coverture, a married woman could not own property in her own right. Any property she possessed before marriage became her husband's. Any property she inherited during marriage became his. Any money she earned, if she was permitted to work, which she often was not, became his. She had no claim on any of these assets. If her husband chose to sell her property, to spend her money, to give away her inheritance, she had no legal recourse. This applied even to the most intimate items. If a woman had brought clothing, jewelry, or personal items into the marriage, these belonged to her husband. He could demand them, sell them, or destroy them. She had no legal right to resist. If a woman had been engaged in trade or business before marriage, that business ceased to belong to her upon marriage. Any contracts she had entered into became void, or became her husband's responsibility. If she had been earning her own living, that livelihood could be terminated simply by the fact of marriage. A married woman could not enter into contracts. If she needed to purchase something, she could not do so in her own name. She could not borrow money. She could not be held responsible for debts in the legal sense, because she had no legal capacity to incur them. But this absence of legal responsibility was not a protection. It was an absence of agency. She was a non-entity in the eyes of the law. A married woman could not sue or be sued in her own name. If she was wronged, if someone stole from her, assaulted her, defamed her, she could not take legal action. Only her husband could do so, and he could choose whether or not to pursue the matter. She was dependent on his will, his judgment, and his willingness to act on her behalf. A married woman could not make a will without her husband's permission. She could not decide independently what would happen to her property after her death. She could not designate guardians for her children. She could not control her own estate. If a married woman committed a crime, the law recognized a doctrine of coverture in her favor. She was presumed to have acted under her husband's coercion. But this protection worked primarily to shield her husband from the full consequences of crimes they committed together. A woman who committed a crime could face prosecution, but the law's assumption that she had acted under her husband's direction could complicate her defense or her sentencing. These legal restrictions applied to virtually all married women of any class. A wealthy woman, no matter how intelligent, no matter how educated, no matter how capable of managing her own affairs, had no more legal standing than a poor woman. Both were, in the eyes of the law, non-entities, absorbed into their husbands' identities. There were some limited exceptions. A woman could, before marriage, enter into a marriage settlement, a legal document that attempted to protect some portion of her property from her husband's control. These settlements required the involvement of lawyers and had to be carefully drafted. They were, in essence, formal acknowledgments that the normal rules of coverture worked grave injustices, and that some protection was necessary. But these settlements were available only to women of means, to women whose fathers or families were sufficiently concerned and sufficiently wealthy to establish them. Even with a settlement, a woman's control over her own property was limited and fragile. A settlement could be challenged. A husband could pressure his wife to sign documents giving him control. The settlement was meant to protect, but it offered only partial protection, and it was accessible only to the wealthiest women. For the vast majority of married women, coverture meant a complete legal erasure. This erasure had consequences that rippled through every aspect of their lives. Consider, for example, the question of where a woman lived. A husband had the legal right to determine the family's residence. If a woman wished to live elsewhere, she had no legal right to do so. If she left her husband's home, she could be legally compelled to return. The concept of a woman's separate dwelling place was not recognized in law. A woman's home was where her husband decreed it to be. Consider the question of a woman's children. A husband had complete legal authority over the children. He could decide how they would be educated, what religion they would practice, where they would live. He could apprentice them, send them away to school, or put them to work. In the event of separation or divorce, the children belonged to him. He had no obligation to consult his wife about decisions concerning them. They were his children, and she had no legal claim to custody or even visitation. If a woman left her husband, if she fled because of cruelty, infidelity, or simple incompatibility, she had to leave behind any children old enough to be considered beyond infancy. She had no legal right to them. She could not take them with her. She could not see them. They were her husband's property in a sense, and she was entitled to no access to them. This was a powerful deterrent to women who might otherwise have left unhappy marriages. A woman might endure nearly anything rather than be separated from her children. Consider the question of a woman's body. Once married, a woman's body belonged to her husband, legally speaking. He had a right to sexual access to her person. She had no right to refuse him. The concept of marital rape did not exist in law. If a husband forced himself upon his wife, he was not committing rape, because a wife, having accepted her marital duties through the act of marriage, could not, in legal terms, refuse. This was law, not merely custom or expectation. There were some practical limitations to this right. If a husband's demands became so extreme that they endangered his wife's life or health, a legal separation might be granted on grounds of cruelty. But this was rare, and the bar for proving cruelty was extremely high. A woman had to prove not merely that her husband forced himself upon her, but that his actions rose to the level of cruelty severe enough to justify legal intervention. Most such cases failed. Moreover, even if a woman obtained a legal separation, she was not free to remarry. Divorce was extremely rare and extremely expensive, available only to the wealthy and only on specific grounds. A woman could be separated from her husband, yet remain his legal wife, unable to marry another, unable to escape the legal bonds that bound her to him. Consider the question of a woman's earnings, if she worked. If a woman was employed as a teacher, a governess, a needleworker, or in some other capacity, her wages belonged to her husband. She had earned them, she had performed the labor, but the money was legally his. He could take it without asking. He could spend it as he chose. She had no claim upon it, no right to manage it, no control over how it was used. Some husbands gave their wives an allowance, a portion of their own earnings or property that was designated for household expenses or personal use. But this allowance was a gift, given at the husband's discretion. It could be reduced or withdrawn at any time. A woman had no right to it. She was receiving charity from her husband, not managing her own resources. Consider the cumulative impact of these legal disabilities. A woman was, in legal terms, a perpetual dependent. She could not own property. She could not control her earnings. She could not enter into contracts. She could not control her body. She could not even maintain a relationship with her children. She was entirely dependent on her husband's willingness to treat her fairly, to give her access to resources, to respect her wishes, to refrain from exercising the absolute power the law had given him. If her husband was kind, if he chose to respect her wishes and to share control of resources with her, then her condition might be tolerable. But if her husband was cruel, if he was profligate with money, if he was violent or controlling, she had virtually no legal recourse. She could not leave him and maintain her children. She could not take her property and start anew. She was trapped, legally and financially. Some women attempted to resist. Some sought legal separations on grounds of cruelty or adultery. Some tried to hide earnings or maintain secret savings. Some negotiated with their husbands for control over household money or personal property. Some attempted to establish businesses or earn income in their own right, though the law made this exceedingly difficult. But for the most part, women had to accept the system. They had to hope that their husbands would be reasonable, that they would not abuse the absolute power the law had given them, that marriage would prove tolerable rather than unbearable. The law did not change all at once. Throughout the Victorian period, there were gradual reforms. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed in 1870 and expanded in 1882, began to restore to married women the right to own and control property. These reforms were significant and genuinely improved many women's situations. But they came late in the Victorian period, and they did not entirely overturn the doctrine of coverture. Even after these reforms, married women retained fewer legal rights than unmarried women or men. Moreover, these legal reforms were not universal in their application or acceptance. In some places, in some courts, in some families, the old understanding persisted. And even where the law changed, social attitudes changed more slowly. Husbands who had grown accustomed to absolute power did not easily relinquish it. Women who had been taught to see their subordination as natural did not immediately assert their new rights. The legal cage within which Victorian women lived was constructed from centuries of law and custom, reinforced by ideology, supported by religious teaching, and accepted, in many cases, as natural and inevitable. It was a cage so complete that many people within it could not see its bars. Yet we must be careful not to portray Victorian women as merely victims of a legal system that crushed them into passivity. Across the historical record, we find women who challenged the system, who negotiated within it, who found ways around it, and who ultimately contributed to its reform. Some of these women are remembered: the suffragettes who fought for political rights, the reformers who advocated for legal change, but many more are forgotten, leaving only traces in letters and diaries, in legal documents and census records. The legal system created constraints, but it did not create complete and universal powerlessness. Women found ways to resist, to maintain agency, to assert themselves. The history of Victorian marriage is not merely a history of oppression, it is also a history of resilience, creativity, and the human capacity to find freedom even within the most restrictive systems. We have spoken thus far of marriage as a legal arrangement, as a social performance, as a system of control. Now we must turn our attention to what marriage meant for the female body itself, to the medical realities that were inextricably bound up with marriage, particularly with the aspect of marriage that society considered most important, motherhood. For a Victorian woman, marriage and pregnancy were nearly inseparable. While we have noted that some women did manage to limit their fertility, the average married woman spent much of her married life either pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. The interval between pregnancies was often brief, a year or less. A woman who married at 20 and remained fertile until her early 40s might bear 10, 12, or even more children. Her body existed, for much of her adult life, in a state of constant pregnancy, birth, recovery, and renewed pregnancy. What did this mean physically? Pregnancy itself was understood, in Victorian medical theory, as a fundamentally pathological condition. It was not seen as a natural state, but as an illness, something that disrupted the body's normal functioning. Medical texts of the period describe pregnancy in terms that emphasize its danger, its discomfort, and the way it taxed the female constitution. A pregnant woman was expected to withdraw from public life to a significant degree. As her pregnancy became visible, she was expected to remain in the home, to receive only close family and intimate friends. The sight of a visibly pregnant woman was considered improper, potentially offensive to delicate sensibilities. Pregnant women wore voluminous garments, designed to conceal their condition as much as possible, even as they grew larger and more obviously pregnant. The physical experience of pregnancy was one of discomfort and sometimes severe suffering. The weight of the growing child, combined with the corset that many women continued to wear even while pregnant, though some doctors advised against it, created chronic pain in the back, the pelvis, and the abdomen. Nausea, constipation, and other digestive disturbances were common. Swollen extremities, varicose veins, and other circulatory problems afflicted many pregnant women. Sleep was difficult, as the woman's expanding body made comfortable positions increasingly rare. For working-class women, pregnancy did not mean cessation of labor. A woman might continue to work in a factory, to do laundry, to carry water, to engage in whatever form of labor was necessary for her family's survival, until she went into labor. The physical toll was immense. Medical care during pregnancy was limited, and when available, often harmful. Doctors of the period had only rudimentary understanding of pregnancy and its complications. They could not detect the various conditions that might threaten the pregnancy or the mother's life. They could not effectively treat most complications. Their interventions were often more dangerous than the conditions they attempted to treat. The idea of prenatal care, regular examinations, monitoring of the mother's health, preparation for birth, was virtually unknown. A woman might see a doctor once or twice during her pregnancy, or she might receive no professional medical care at all, instead relying on the knowledge of a midwife, usually an older woman with practical experience in birth but without formal training. And then came labor. Labor was understood as a profoundly dangerous event. The risks were real and significant. Death in childbirth was a common occurrence, not rare. The leading causes of death for women of childbearing age were complications related to pregnancy and birth, childbed fever, hemorrhage, complications of difficult labors, and other obstetric emergencies. The process of labor was long, often lasting many hours or even days. A woman in labor experienced intense, increasing pain as the uterus contracted, working to expel the child. She might scream, might beg for relief, might feel that she was dying, and in a sense she was in danger of dying. Without modern medical interventions, without antibiotics, without the ability to control hemorrhage or manage complications, many labors that are now routine medical events ended in tragedy. The standard treatment for pain during labor was minimal. Chloroform or ether might be offered, particularly to wealthy women, but these anesthetics carried their own risks. They could depress respiration, could harm the developing child, could lead to complications. Many women labored without anesthesia, enduring the full force of contractions without relief. The birth itself was often difficult. If the child was large, or in an abnormal position, or if there were other complications, the birth could become obstructed. The woman's body might not be able to expel the child. Medical interventions, forceps, craniotomy, the crushing of the child's skull to allow delivery of a dead or dying child, or other extreme measures, might be necessary. These interventions were traumatic, dangerous, and often resulted in severe internal injuries to the mother. Tearing was common. The tissues of the perineum, the area between the vagina and the anus, would tear as the child passed through, sometimes slightly, sometimes severely. These tears could reach up into the vagina, into the bladder, into the rectum. They were sewn up with whatever materials and techniques were available, often resulting in permanent damage, chronic pain, and functional problems. Once the child was born, the placenta had to be expelled. If this did not occur naturally, it had to be manually removed, a dangerous and painful procedure that could tear the uterus, could cause massive hemorrhage, or could introduce infection. And then, if the woman survived, came the postpartum period, the recovery that was supposed to take place over the following weeks and months. Childbed fever, now understood to be caused by bacterial infection, was the great killer of new mothers. A woman who survived the birth might die days or weeks later, burning with fever, her condition deteriorating as infections spread through her body. There was no effective treatment. Doctors bled women, administered various medicines, but these interventions were useless against bacterial infection. The woman either recovered on her own, or she died. Other complications were also common. Hemorrhage could occur, draining a woman of blood until she weakened and died. Infection of the uterus, of the bladder, of the perineal tears could develop. Milk fever, now understood to be a form of mastitis, could afflict nursing mothers. Emotional disturbance, what we would now recognize as postpartum depression, could descend, leaving a woman in a state of despair or agitation. The physical recovery from childbirth was slow. A woman's body had been stretched and torn and traumatized. Even if she survived, even if there were no major complications, she was weakened, in pain, and needed weeks or months to recover her strength. Yet she was expected to recover quickly. If her husband demanded sexual relations, she was expected to comply. If household duties needed to be performed, she was expected to perform them. If she had children from previous births, they needed care and attention. The combination of repeated pregnancies, the physical trauma of each birth, the inadequate recovery time, and the ongoing demands of motherhood meant that many women's health was permanently damaged. Women who had borne many children often suffered from chronic pain, from prolapse of the uterus, from incontinence, from chronic infections, and from general debility and weakness. Consider the arithmetic of this. A woman who married at 20 and bore 8 children at roughly 2-year intervals would be approximately 36 years old when her last child was born. By that age, having spent roughly 16 years in a state of near constant pregnancy, or recovery from pregnancy, her body would likely be permanently damaged. She would face the remaining 20 or 30 years of her life, if she was fortunate enough to live that long, with chronic pain, reduced energy, and various functional problems related to the trauma her body had endured. And yet, motherhood was presented as women's highest calling, their most important role, their greatest source of fulfillment, the suffering involved in bearing children, the danger to their health and lives, the permanent damage to their bodies. All of this was accepted as natural, as the price of motherhood, as something noble and good. The ideology of motherhood during the Victorian period was extraordinarily powerful. Mothers were supposed to be selfless, devoted entirely to their children's welfare, willing to sacrifice anything for them. A woman who complained of the physical toll of repeated pregnancies was considered selfish. A woman who did not want more children was considered unnatural. A woman who resented the dangers and suffering of childbirth was considered lacking in proper maternal feeling. Yet some women did resist. Some women found ways to limit their pregnancies, as we have discussed. Some women wrote in private diaries about their fears of childbirth, their dread of becoming pregnant again, their despair at the thought of yet another child. Some women turned away from their husbands sexually, accepting the consequences, rather than enduring yet another pregnancy. Some women took herbal abortifacients, knowing the dangers, preferring the risk to the certainty of another dangerous pregnancy. The information available about birth control was limited, and much of it was ineffective or dangerous. Yet women shared what knowledge they had. Older women advised younger women. Midwives and female friends exchanged information. Contraceptive devices were advertised in newspapers and obtained through mail order, often with euphemistic language that made their purpose somewhat obscure. Women also turned to abortion, though it was illegal and dangerous. Early abortion, before the fetus quickened or began to move noticeably, was sometimes tolerated or at least overlooked. Later abortion was more clearly criminal, yet women sought it out, knowing the risks, driven by desperation. Some abortions occurred naturally, miscarriages, and it was not always clear whether a miscarriage had occurred spontaneously, or whether the woman had deliberately induced it. The line was deliberately obscured in medical practice, allowing doctors and others to maintain plausible deniability about what they suspected had occurred. The maternal mortality rate during the Victorian period was high by modern standards, though there is some debate about the exact figures. What is clear is that death in childbirth was a real possibility, something every woman contemplated. There was a phrase used by women when they were pregnant: they were in an interesting condition, or they spoke of being in danger. The language itself acknowledges the danger inherent in pregnancy and birth. Miscarriage was also common. Perhaps 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 pregnancies ended in miscarriage, either naturally or deliberately. The experience of miscarriage could be as traumatic as the experience of childbirth. A woman might bleed heavily, might pass recognizable fetal tissue, might face infection or other complications. And then, she had to endure the loss, the grief, often compounded by the knowledge that she would likely become pregnant again soon. The physical burden of motherhood was extreme, yet it was also invisible in the culture's narratives about women and marriage. The ideology of motherhood emphasized the emotional and moral rewards of bearing and raising children. It emphasized women's duty, their sacrifice, their love. What it did not emphasize was the physical cost, the danger, the permanent alteration of women's bodies. Some women died. Thousands upon thousands of women died from pregnancy and birth-related causes. Some died in the midst of giving birth, hemorrhaging or suffering from eclampsia or other acute emergencies. Some died days or weeks later from childbed fever or other infections. Some died months later from complications that had their roots in the damage done during childbirth. Some died not from pregnancy itself, but from the cumulative effects of multiple pregnancies on bodies that had never fully recovered from previous ones. And these deaths were accepted as the natural cost of motherhood. Widowers took new wives and had more children with them. Children grew up knowing that their mothers had died bringing them into the world. It was tragic, but it was also natural, expected, the price of the continuation of society. For those women who survived, the legacy of repeated pregnancies lasted the rest of their lives. Their bodies bore the marks, the stretched skin, the permanent changes in their organs, the scars from tears and repairs, the changes in their sexuality and their physical capacities. They aged rapidly, worn down by repeated trauma and insufficient recovery. By their 50s, many women looked and felt decades older than their chronological age. Yet this profound physical reality, the danger, the suffering, the permanent alteration of women's bodies, remained largely unspoken. It existed in the background of Victorian life, shaping women's experiences but not acknowledged in polite conversation. It was simply the cost of being a woman, of being married, of being a mother. We have traced, through our journey thus far, the elaborate architecture of constraint that Victorian society constructed around marriage and women. We have examined the legal structures that stripped women of their rights, the social pressures that enforced marriage as a woman's only respectable path, the physical dangers that came with motherhood, the sexual expectations placed upon women's bodies, the ideology that presented these constraints as natural and good. It is easy, given all of this, to imagine Victorian women as entirely passive victims, without agency, without choice, without the capacity to shape their own lives. Yet this would be a profound misreading of history. Across the historical record, in letters and diaries, in legal documents, in the stories preserved in family histories, in the traces left by women who resisted and endured, we find evidence of women who did not accept the system as immutable. They found ways to negotiate within it, to resist it, to carve out spaces of autonomy and meaning. Their resistance was often quiet, often invisible, often undocumented, but it was real and it mattered. Let us consider first the question of marriage refusal. While society presented marriage as inevitable, as the only acceptable path for women, some women did refuse it. The reasons varied. Some refused because they had fallen in love with men they could not marry, men of lower social status, men already married, men from different religious backgrounds. Some refused because they found the prospect of sexual relations repellent or frightening. Some refused because they had witnessed unhappy marriages and feared the same fate. Some refused simply because they did not wish to relinquish their independence, their freedom, their control over their own lives. To refuse marriage in Victorian society was to invite shame, to be labeled as odd or difficult, to be subject to family pressure and social scrutiny. Yet some women persisted in their refusal. They remained unmarried, and in doing so, they retained certain legal and practical autonomies. They maintained the right to control their own property, to enter into contracts, to travel. They built lives for themselves as teachers, as writers, as artists, as caregivers to elderly parents or other relatives. They formed deep emotional bonds with other women. They participated in intellectual life, in charitable work, in the emerging women's movements. Not all of these women were entirely happy with their choices. Some regretted their refusal when they found themselves aging without family support, without the security that marriage might have provided, without the companionship that marriage offered. But others found, in their unmarried state, a freedom and a fulfillment that married women could not access. They had chosen their fate, and however constrained their options, they had exercised choice in a system that offered very little of it. Let us consider, next, the question of marital negotiation. Some women, married to men of reasonable temperament, managed to negotiate informal arrangements that gave them a degree of control over their lives. A woman might convince her husband to allow her to manage household finances, to make decisions about the children's education, to pursue intellectual interests or charitable work. A woman might establish what amounted to veto power over her husband's sexual demands through consistent refusal, or through health conditions, real or claimed, that made sexual relations inadvisable. A woman might maintain a degree of financial independence, perhaps from inheritance or from earnings that her husband allowed her to keep. These negotiations were informal, based on personal relationships and power dynamics that the law did not recognize. They were precarious, subject to change if a husband's temperament changed or if financial circumstances shifted. But they provided, for some women, a measure of practical autonomy that mitigated the legal disabilities of coverture. Some husbands were moved by affection for their wives to grant them greater freedom than the law required. Some husbands recognized their wives' intelligence and capability and deferred to them on certain matters. Some marriages operated, in practice, as more equitable partnerships than the law would allow or society would openly acknowledge. We do not know how common these arrangements were. The silence of the historical record makes it difficult to assess, but they existed, and they made lives more bearable for the women involved. Let us consider the question of work and economic independence. While middle-class ideology held that respectable married women should not work, some women did. Some continued in professions or work they had practiced before marriage. Some took up new work after marriage, whether with their husband's knowledge and permission or without it. Some worked in family businesses, providing labor that was unpaid and often unacknowledged. Some took in piecework, needlework, laundry, the production of goods for sale, while maintaining their role as housewives. The motivation for this work was often financial necessity, particularly for working-class women. But for some women, particularly educated women who had practiced professions before marriage, the motivation was also the desire to maintain intellectual engagement, to preserve a sense of identity and competence, to retain some degree of economic independence. Governesses who married men of modest means sometimes continued working, teaching their own children and perhaps taking in a few additional pupils for pay. Writers and artists who married sometimes continued their work, publishing under their own names or under pseudonyms. Some women maintained small businesses in addition to their domestic duties. These women worked in a kind of shadowy space between the ideology of married women as leisured and dependent, and the reality of their participation in economic life. Let us consider the question of intellectual engagement and public life. While respectable married women were supposed to confine themselves to domestic and social life, some women found ways to participate in intellectual and public discourse. Some attended lectures on scientific or historical topics. Some participated in charitable organizations, which provided structure and purpose outside the home. Some became involved in religious or moral reform movements. Some wrote letters, diaries, perhaps published articles or books. The most prominent examples are the women who became involved in the suffrage movement, in campaigns for legal reform, in the emerging women's movements. These women were often married, and their involvement in public activism sometimes put strain on their marriages, sometimes required them to operate against their husbands' wishes, sometimes led to separation or estrangement. But they persisted, driven by conviction, by anger at injustice, by a sense that change was necessary. Less prominently documented, but no less significant, were the countless women who engaged in intellectual life on a smaller scale. Women who read widely, who thought deeply about the conditions of their lives, who discussed ideas with other women, women who questioned the ideology they had been taught, who recognized the injustices embedded in their society, who chafed against the constraints imposed upon them. Let us consider the question of sexuality and reproduction. We have already discussed how some women managed to limit their fertility despite cultural opposition and legal restriction. But we should also consider the forms of sexual resistance available to women. Some women refused sexual relations with their husbands, accepting the consequences, the marital discord, the potential for their husbands to seek sexual outlet elsewhere, rather than continuing to bear children or to submit to sexual acts they found repellent. Some women found ways to make sexual relations more tolerable or more infrequent. They might claim chronic illness or injury. They might negotiate specific times when relations would be acceptable. They might establish separate sleeping arrangements, ostensibly for health or comfort reasons. They might use menstruation as a barrier, though medical ideology of the period suggested that sexual relations during menstruation were dangerous and should be avoided. Some women may have used this belief to extend the number of days when they could legitimately refuse their husbands. Some women, as we have noted, sought out contraceptive information and used whatever methods were available to them. Some women had abortions, risking their health and their lives to avoid bearing another child. Some women attempted to manage their pregnancies and births in ways that maximized their safety, seeking out experienced midwives rather than doctors, attending to their own health during pregnancy, preparing for birth in ways they believed would help them. These acts of resistance around sexuality and reproduction were not always conscious resistance, not always part of a deliberate strategy. Some were simply practical solutions to intolerable situations. But they represent, nonetheless, women's attempts to maintain some control over their own bodies, to exercise agency in a system that was designed to deny them agency. Let us consider the question of emotional life and relationships. While married women were supposed to direct all their emotional energy toward their husbands and children, some women formed deep emotional bonds with other women. These relationships existed in various forms. Some were the result of long-term friendships, perhaps maintained from before the woman's marriage. Some developed between female relatives. Some grew out of participation in charitable or religious work. Some of these relationships were explicitly emotional and intimate, though not necessarily sexual in the way we would understand it now. Victorian culture, ironically, tolerated intense emotional intimacy between women in ways it did not tolerate between men and women outside of marriage. Two women might share a bed, exchange passionate letters, express deep affection and devotion to each other, and this would not necessarily be considered improper. The homosocial world of women, the world of female friends, female relatives, female servants, had its own emotional intensity and meaning. For some women, these relationships with other women provided what marriage did not: genuine companionship, emotional understanding, freedom from the constraints of a husband's authority. Some women's deepest commitments were to other women rather than to their husbands. These relationships could coexist with marriage. A woman might be a dutiful wife while also maintaining an intense emotional bond with a female friend. Or, in some cases, a woman might choose to remain unmarried in order to maintain her relationship with another woman. Let us consider the question of personal autonomy and the spaces women carved out for themselves. Despite the ideology of the married woman as entirely absorbed in domestic and familial duties, women managed to maintain spaces of privacy and autonomy. A woman might have a room of her own, a sitting room where she spent time alone, where she read or wrote or simply thought, undisturbed by her husband or children. A woman might maintain a secret correspondence, exchanging letters with friends or even distant relatives in which she expressed thoughts and feelings she did not share with her family. A woman might develop rituals and practices that were hers alone: a daily walk, a practice of meditation or prayer, time spent in a particular hobby or pursuit. In these small ways, women maintained a sense of individual identity separate from their roles as wives and mothers. They preserved a part of themselves that was not absorbed into their families, that remained their own. Let us consider the question of aging. As women aged and moved past childbearing years, their role in the household changed. They might become less subject to sexual demands, less constantly occupied with pregnancy and childbirth. They might gain authority in the household, becoming the keeper of family knowledge, the manager of resources, the ultimate authority on matters of domestic life. Their husbands, as they aged, might become less domineering, more dependent on their wives' knowledge and competence. Some women found, in their later years, a degree of freedom and authority they had not possessed before. Elderly women could be formidable figures in their households and their communities. They could exercise influence on younger women, could make decisions, could speak with authority on matters of family and property. This freedom came late, after decades of subordination, but it was freedom nonetheless. Let us consider the question of resistance through memory and story. Women preserved knowledge through stories told to their daughters, through family histories passed down, through the preservation of letters and documents. In these ways, women maintained their own understanding of their history, their own interpretations of events, their own perspectives on their lives. While official histories might present Victorian women as passive and content, the stories women told to each other, preserved in family archives, often present a more complex, more resistant picture. Finally, let us acknowledge the resistance of simply enduring, of surviving, of maintaining sanity and selfhood, in a system designed to deny both. For some women, resistance was not an active choice, but the continuation of existence. They bore the constraints, they fulfilled their duties, they accepted their subordination. But in doing so, they also persisted. They did not disappear into their roles. They remained themselves, even as they were constrained by them. This is not to romanticize suffering, or to suggest that endurance was the same as freedom. Many women were genuinely broken by their circumstances, genuinely destroyed by repeated pregnancies, or abusive husbands, or crushing loneliness. Many women's lives were tragedies, and no amount of individual resistance could have changed that. But it is to say that Victorian women were not merely passive victims, that they exercised such agency as was available to them, that they found ways, large and small, to assert themselves, to maintain autonomy, to resist the system that constrained them. The history of Victorian marriage is not merely a history of oppression, it is also a history of human creativity and resilience in the face of systematic constraint. It is a history of women finding ways to live, to love, to think, to resist, despite enormous odds. And it is in these stories of resistance, alongside the stories of suffering, that we find the full complexity of women's experience in this era. As we approach the end of our historical journey through Victorian marriage, it is worth pausing to consider what happened next, and what the legacy of this period means for us now. The Victorian era did not end in a sudden rupture. Society did not transform overnight, at the moment Queen Victoria died in 1901. Yet the forces that would reshape the institutions of marriage and the legal position of women were already in motion by the end of the 19th century, and the 20th century would bring profound changes. The reforms to married women's property rights, which we mentioned earlier, represented the beginning of a legal transformation. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 restored to married women the right to own and control property, to enter into contracts, to keep their own earnings. These reforms were significant, but they came late and they were incomplete. Even after these reforms, married women retained fewer legal rights than unmarried women or men. The concept of coverture persisted, though it was gradually diminished, but the legal changes were only part of a larger transformation. The women's suffrage movement, which grew throughout the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, was driven in large part by women's desire to escape the legal disabilities and social constraints that marriage imposed. The suffragettes, women who engaged in direct action, in civil disobedience, in public protest, were fighting for political rights, but also for a broader transformation of women's legal and social status. As the 20th century progressed, divorce became more accessible, though it remained rare and expensive, and carried significant social stigma. The development and widespread availability of contraception, first the diaphragm and spermicide, later oral contraceptives, gave women unprecedented control over their own fertility. The opening of higher education to women, the expansion of employment opportunities, the transformation of women's roles during and after the World Wars, all contributed to a gradual reshaping of marriage and its meaning. Yet even as the legal and social structures changed, much remained the same. Long into the 20th century, women who married were expected to leave employment, to become housewives, to subordinate their own interests to those of their husbands and children. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime in many jurisdictions until very recently, well into the late 20th century. The ideology of motherhood, though less overwhelming than in the Victorian era, remained powerful. Women's property rights and autonomy continued to be curtailed upon marriage in many places and in many ways. The experience of Victorian marriage, though it is now more than a century past, did not simply end and disappear. It created legacies that persisted. The trauma of repeated pregnancies and births, the medical complications that lasted a lifetime, the generations of women whose bodies and spirits had been damaged by the Victorian system. These legacies rippled through the 20th century and into our own time. The psychological and emotional patterns established by Victorian marriage, the conditioning of women to be passive, to be accommodating, to expect to subordinate themselves to their husbands, persisted in many families for generations. Daughters learned from their mothers, from their grandmothers, patterns of deference and self-denial that had been established in the Victorian era. The attitudes toward women's sexuality, the shame and confusion that surrounded physical intimacy, the presumption that women did not and should not experience sexual desire. These attitudes persisted long after the legal structures that had reinforced them had begun to crumble. Yet there were also women who consciously broke with these patterns. Daughters of Victorian marriages looked at their mothers' lives and resolved to live differently. Women of the early 20th century, with access to education and employment in contraception, made choices their mothers and grandmothers could not have made. Some married on their own terms, maintaining their careers and their independence. Some chose not to marry at all. Some had children outside of marriage, though this remained deeply stigmatized. Some married other women, though this too remained hidden in a way that echoed the silences of the Victorian era. The experience of Victorian marriage and its aftermath created, in some measure, the conditions for the women's liberation movements of the later 20th century. Women who understood, viscerally, the constraints and dangers of marriage as it had been constructed, whether from their own experience or from witnessing their mother's experience, were motivated to fight for change. The fight was long, and in many ways it continues, but it was impelled in part by the memory of what marriage had meant and what it had cost in the Victorian era. Let us consider briefly how the realities of Victorian marriage illuminate our understanding of our own time. We no longer live under the legal doctrine of coverture. Married women can own property, enter into contracts, maintain their own earnings, and have legal rights equal to men in many, though not all, respects. We have contraception, and women can, in principle, control their own fertility. We have access to legal abortion, though this access is increasingly constrained in many places. We have employment opportunities, higher education, the possibility of living as single women or as women in relationships that are not marriages. Yet many of the underlying patterns persist. The expectation that women will do most of the emotional and domestic labor in relationships remains powerful. The assumption that men will make major decisions, that women will accommodate themselves to their partners, that women's own ambitions and interests will be subordinated to family needs. These patterns, though they are now contested rather than universal, remain influential. The wages gap between men and women, the concentration of women in lower-paid professions, the expectation that women will be the primary caregivers for children and elderly relatives, all of these represent the persistence of economic and social patterns that have their roots in the legal and ideological structures of the Victorian era. The ongoing struggles around reproductive autonomy, the constant threat to access to contraception and abortion, represent the persistence of attempts to control women's sexuality and fertility. The debates about whether women should be in the workplace, whether motherhood is being neglected, whether women are becoming too independent, these debates echo the Victorian anxiety about women's proper role, though the language has changed. The persistence of violence against women, including marital violence, represents the persistence of attitudes that treat women's bodies as available to men, that deny women autonomy and agency. The ongoing silence around sexual assault and domestic abuse, the difficulty many women face in leaving abusive relationships, the legal and social barriers that perpetuate women's vulnerability, all of these connect back to the systems that were established and normalized in the Victorian era. To understand Victorian marriage, then, is not merely to understand history, it is to understand the roots of patterns that persist in our own time. It is to recognize that the constraints on women, though they have been substantially diminished, have not been entirely overcome. It is to see that the struggle for women's autonomy, for women's control over their own bodies, for women's equality in law and in practice, This struggle is not ancient history. It is ongoing. It is immediate. It is present. And yet, as we reflect on what we have learned in our journey through Victorian marriage, we should also reflect on something else: the resilience, creativity, and agency of the women who lived through that system. Despite the overwhelming constraints, despite the legal disabilities and social pressures and physical dangers, women persisted. They found ways to live, to think, to love, to resist. They made choices, even when the options available to them were severely limited. They maintained their humanity and their individual identity, even as the system attempted to erase both. This, too, is part of the legacy of Victorian marriage, not only the suffering and the constraint, but also the evidence that even under systematic oppression, even when the law itself denies a person's personhood, human beings find ways to assert themselves, to maintain autonomy, to resist. The women of the Victorian era did not have the tools and resources available to modern women. They did not have legal equality, access to contraception, employment opportunities, or educational access as we understand it. Yet they resisted, they negotiated, they endured, they persisted. Understanding this, understanding both the depth of the constraints and the persistence of women's agency in the face of, allows us to see the present moment with clearer eyes. It shows us how much has changed, but also how much remains to be done. It shows us that rights and freedoms, once gained, are not automatically permanent. It shows us that the liberation of women is not a project of the past, but an ongoing work. As we lie here in the comfort of our own time, with rights and protections that were won through the struggle of previous generations, we might carry with us a sense of gratitude for what has been achieved, and a sense of responsibility to continue that work, to complete what those earlier women began, to extend the gains that have been made, to ensure that the future holds greater freedom and equality than even our own moment can claim. The Victorian era is now more than 100 years past. The women who lived through it are long dead. Their struggles, their suffering, their resistance, their small victories, all of these are history now. Yet history is not merely the past. It is the foundation upon which the present is built. Understanding it allows us to understand ourselves more deeply and to imagine more fully what the future might yet become. We have journeyed now through a long and complex history. We have walked through the corridors of Victorian homes, witnessed the daily lives of women constrained by expectation and law. We have traced the path that led young women into marriage, the careful conditioning, the social pressures, the seemingly inevitable moment when choice became submission. We have explored the mysteries and silences that surrounded sexuality and reproduction, the contradictions that Victorian culture maintained at its heart. We have examined the legal structures that constructed female powerlessness, and we have witnessed the physical toll that repeated pregnancies and births exacted on women's bodies and lives. We have also, importantly, recognized the agency of women within these constraints. We have acknowledged their resistance, their negotiation, their creativity in finding spaces of autonomy and meaning, even within the most restrictive systems. We have understood that history is not simply a story of victims, but of human beings, complex, capable, resilient, navigating circumstances that were profoundly difficult. As we come to the end of our narrative, to the place where we began, in the quiet of evening, there are a few final reflections worth carrying with us. First, we might reflect on the profound difference that law makes. The legal doctrine of coverture, the idea that a married woman ceased to exist as a legal person, was not merely an abstract principle. It had concrete consequences for millions of women. It determined whether they could own property, control their own earnings, make decisions about their children, or exercise any meaningful autonomy. The law did not merely reflect the prejudices of Victorian society. It actively constructed them, gave them force, made them real. Understanding this shows us how deeply systems of law and custom are intertwined, how changing one requires changing the other. Second, we might reflect on the power of ideology. Victorian society maintained ideas about women's nature, that they were passionless, that they were naturally fitted for domestic life, that motherhood was their highest calling. Ideas that served to justify and perpetuate the legal and social structures that constrained them. These ideas were not true reflections of women's actual nature or desires. They were constructs, invented and perpetuated to serve a particular system of social organization. Yet they were extraordinarily powerful. They shaped how women understood themselves, what they thought was possible, what they were willing to accept. Ideology, we see, is not merely a matter of ideas, it is a tool of real power. Third, we might reflect on the resilience of human beings. Despite overwhelming legal disabilities, despite physical dangers that could lead to death, despite social pressures that denied them autonomy and agency, women persisted. They found ways to live with meaning and purpose. Some resisted openly, becoming activists for change. Some resisted quietly, through small acts of negotiation and assertion. Some simply endured, maintaining their dignity and their selfhood in the face of systematic dehumanization. All of these responses are worthy of recognition. The fact that women survived this era at all, that they did not simply disappear into their roles, speaks to something fundamental about human capacity to maintain identity and agency even under the most constrictive circumstances. Fourth, we might reflect on how the past shapes the present. The patterns established in the Victorian era did not simply disappear when the era ended. They persisted, often invisibly, in law and custom, in family structures and personal relationships, in the expectations placed on women and the barriers placed before them. Understanding this historical continuity helps us see our own moment more clearly, helps us recognize patterns that might otherwise seem natural or inevitable, helps us imagine alternatives. Fifth, we might reflect on the ongoing nature of struggle, the achievements that have been won, legal equality, property rights, access to education and employment, reproductive autonomy, are not automatically permanent. They were won through struggle, and they can be lost if not continually defended and extended. The history of Victorian marriage reminds us that freedom is not a state that, once achieved, maintains itself. It requires ongoing vigilance, ongoing commitment, ongoing struggle. And finally, we might reflect on the lives of the women we have encountered in our journey. The young woman being fitted into her corset each morning, the bride on her wedding day, crossing a threshold from which she cannot return, the pregnant woman knowing the dangers she faces, yet having little choice in whether to face them, the mother worn down by repeated pregnancies and births, yet expected to find fulfillment in her role, the wife, constrained by law from controlling her own property or her own body, yet finding small ways to assert herself, the widow, finding in her husband's death a freedom she had never known in his life, the unmarried woman, bearing the shame of her single status yet retaining a degree of autonomy. These women lived real lives, with real hopes and fears, real loves and resentments, real struggles and small victories. Their experiences are not merely historical curiosities or moral lessons. They are part of the human story, part of the long history of how human beings have struggled to maintain meaning and agency in the face of constraint, how people have resisted injustice even when the odds seemed overwhelming, how life persists even in the most difficult circumstances. Now, as we conclude our journey and return to the present moment, we can allow ourselves to rest. The effort of imagination required to inhabit a different time, a different world, with different constraints and different possibilities. This effort can now ease. We can settle back into the comfort of our own era, grateful for the ease and autonomy that we perhaps take for granted. As you lie here, in your bed, warm and safe and comfortable, you might spare a thought for those women of a century and more ago. You might acknowledge, silently, the struggle that was required to create the world in which you now rest. You might recognize that the freedoms you enjoy, the ability to control your own property, to choose whether to marry, to determine whether to have children, to move about in the world without a chaperone. These freedoms came at a cost, paid by women who struggled against systems that seemed immutable. And as sleep approaches, as your thoughts begin to drift and your consciousness begins to fade, you might carry with you a sense of perspective. The concerns of our own day, which so often seem urgent and overwhelming, can be held within the larger context of history. The patterns we see repeating, the struggles for equality, the resistance to those struggles, the slow progress toward greater justice, these patterns have deep roots. Understanding them does not solve them, but it can help us see them with clearer eyes. Let your body settle into the bed. Let your breathing become slow and regular. Let the weight of your awareness gradually lighten. The story we have told is complete now. The voices of Victorian women, their hopes and fears, their complaints and celebrations, their quiet resistance and their patient endurance, have faded back into history. You have witnessed their lives, understood their struggles, recognized their humanity. This witnessing is complete. As sleep draws near, you can rest in the knowledge that you have journeyed far, that you have learned much, that your understanding of the world and the people who came before you has deepened. This is enough. This is all that is required. Allow yourself now to drift. Let the boundaries between wakefulness and sleep soften and blur. Feel yourself sinking deeper into the comfort of your bed, into the safety of the present moment, into the quiet peace of rest. The dark reality of marriage for women in Victorian England is now part of your historical knowledge. You have walked through that world, and you have returned. You are safe. You are here. You are present in a time and place far different from that distant era. Sleep now, carrying with you the wisdom of history, the recognition of those who came before, and the gratitude for the world in which you rest. Good night.